Hey everyone. Today is a follow-up video to my previous one, which was a performance of Messiaen's Louange something. I don't speak French. When I was in college, I took a class on 20th century music and had a very brief introduction to the world of Messiaen. So this piece stuck out to me, and I didn't really think about it until recently, when I was put under self-quarantine, and I didn't actually think of it for a long time until this year, when I was reading a lot of articles about climate change and climate collapse, and there's a specific article that talks about sort of slowing down in the face of urgent times. And this piece kind of came back to my mind because I remember reading that Messiaen wrote it while he was in a POW camp in World War II. And the idea of creating something that sounds so serene from such a violent place was kind of inspiring to me. I started thinking about how I could potentially play this, and I took a look at the sheet music. Here's the sheet music, and you'll notice that it's actually quite straightforward. Most classical pieces, I feel like, would struggle a little bit with being transferred into electronics, but this particular piece, which I also found out recently, was kind of a previous work that Messiaen wrote for some kind of World's Fair, and he did it for 6 Ondes Martenot, which are like these monophonic synth instruments that were extremely expressive at the time. So anyway, looking at this sheet music, I noticed that the piano part is entirely quarter notes, or I mean, they're just repeated notes, and so that seemed like a no-brainer as far as like putting it on the Octatrack and seeing where I could go from there. And so going to the actual Octatrack, what I ended up doing was I thought about different ways I could do it. I thought like maybe I could sort of patch things into each pattern and have each one be one of the notes, but I realized pretty soon that the way that this whole thing was structured, it would actually make a lot more sense to transfer into arrangement mode. So what I ended up doing was I set up all my patterns to be just one chord per pattern. And so you can go through, bank 1, pattern 1, because I didn't want the sequencer to look like it was giving me time. I felt like that would be too distracting. It made a lot more sense for it to kind of like express some kind of motion, at least, instead of being like an actual BPM. And you'll notice it's twice as fast as usual. The tempo is 62. And this really cleaned things up for me, because instead of having to worry about, how long is this pattern and what do I put, what exists in that pattern, I just know that every pattern is a unique chord. And so from that point, it was pretty easy to just go through and transpose all of my chords using P-locks. So I pretty much just went through and programmed one note per pattern, one by one, and then I decided, you'll see that in this sheet music, there's markings saying, this chord needs to be played for 8 times before the next note. So it's kind of like a, alternatively notated piece of music. So every melody note has a number of chords that this chord should be played before you switch to the next one. So all I did was add up those numbers and put them down here. And I was reading the sheet music when I performed it. So that was kind of how I arranged the chords. I set up places where it would halt because there was a point in the song where I'm supposed to repeat, and then after I repeat, it's a solo part. So I kind of like coordinated so that when I finished that part, then I could skip ahead and then start the piece again from this point. This point, is essentially this part 2 here. And as for crescendos and things like that, that was kind of like the additional level of control I had for the piece, where as I was playing, if I saw a crescendo happening, I used the filter on the OB6 which isn't, the best. I kind of wish I could have had some sort of foot pedal that did both filter and dynamics, which I'm sure you could probably program into, say, Ableton and do that way. And then after that, it was pretty much just bass station, and I didn't set up the camera for the bass station, but basically I just designed a patch that I thought would sound like a theremin. So essentially the way that I recorded all of this was I had my OB6 running into my desktop, and I had the bass station running through the Octatrack, which is then running through my analog heat, which is below here. And what that lets me do is use the analog heat specifically for the bass station. And so what I ended up doing with that was creating a high-pass filter that kind of just cut off some of the low end to give the chords a bit more room to move. And one thing that also let me do was I could use the low-pass filter on the bass station to double as a dynamics knob, because if I lowered the low pass into the threshold of my analog heats filter, which is a high pass, then the note would disappear into that sort of in-between space. And so that was a way that I could like play with crescendo without having to, add a third knob to like an already somewhat, complicated performance. So I'll kind of demonstrate that here, right there. So it's a really subtle effect, but essentially, if I pull up the low end, then I create a carved out spot where if I pull the low end, if I pull the low pass below that threshold there, then the note will disappear. So that gave me a spot where I could create crescendo. And that just gave me a little bit more control than I would normally have if I was using just a static attack level or attack delay or of some kind. I feel like being able to use a knob to adjust the crescendo of the note is kind of a nice quality of life improvement. And that's pretty much it. This piece was pretty straightforward, which was pretty great because most classical pieces are pretty hard to transfer into something that's so, hard sequenced. But I really enjoyed doing it. I'll probably do more versions of it and kind of play with ways that I could increase the musicality of the performance. I was trying to figure out ways that I could use a foot pedal to adjust the tempo on the project, or on the Octatrack. I think what I might try is to use the Expression Pedal Max plugin that my friend told me about and route the MIDI out, or MIDI in, route the MIDI in into Ableton and control the slaved tempo from the Octatrack within Ableton using an Expression Pedal. I do think that could be worthwhile because there's just so much you can do if you're controlling the tempo with your foot. So definitely something I'll look into. But aside from that, yeah, let me know what you think. If you have any other questions, let me know. And until next time.